The call had pulled me from a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind only exhaustion can bring. Now, the sterile chill of the hospital morgue intake area after midnight was a sharp slap to the senses. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the quiet too. A thick, oppressive silence broken only by the low thrum of refrigeration units and the distant, almost musical whine of an elevator ascending. I pulled the collar of my worn tweed jacket tighter, wishing for another layer. My internal clock, usually a reliable instrument, felt completely out of whack. The detective was already there, leaning against a stainless steel counter that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. His arms were crossed, face a tight mask of frustration. He looked like he'd been through a long night, which, given the circumstances, he certainly had. "William," he said, pushing off the counter, his voice a low rumble. "Thanks for coming out. Again, sorry about the hour." I just nodded my usual response. Small talk wasn't my forte, especially not when my brain was still trying to fully boot up. My eyes were already scanning the room, absorbing details. The faint scent of disinfectant and something metallic underlying everything. The pristine floor, scrubbed so clean it reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. The neatly stacked, empty gurneys, everything in its place. "It's a mess, William," the detective continued, gesturing vaguely towards a closed gurney draped with a pristine white sheet. "Or rather, it's not a mess, that's the problem." I understood immediately. A crime scene too clean was often more troubling than a chaotic one. It spoke of intent, of calculation. "The CEO, Maxwell Thorne," the detective explained, his voice flat. "Found in his penthouse apartment, shot once clean through the head. The initial response team, then forensics. They've got nothing. No forced entry, no fingerprints, not a single viable print. No weapon, no shell casings. No blood spatter beyond the immediate impact area, and even that was contained. It's like the place was vacuumed, wiped down, then vacuumed again. A ghost operation." My stomach tightened. This was exactly the kind of impossible puzzle that both fascinated and infuriated me. Most people saw nothing. My job was to see the absence of nothing, and then, hopefully, find the something that had been overlooked. "And the victim?" I asked, my gaze fixed on the sheet-draped form. The detective sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "That's why I'm here. We've done the initial examination. The medical examiner is stumped on any trace evidence. Clean as a whistle. No fibers, no foreign hairs, no skin under the nails, nothing that points to a struggle or even a brief contact. It's like the killer wore a full hazmat suit, then took a shower and changed clothes before leaving." He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "We know I'm the last resort, William. If anyone can find something, it's I, but frankly, I'm not optimistic." I felt a familiar spark, a quiet determination igniting in my chest. Doubt, even from a seasoned detective, rarely deterred me. It usually just sharpened my focus. The more impossible a scene, the more satisfying the eventual discovery. "May I?" asked, moving towards the gurney. The detective nodded, stepping back to give me space. "Be my guest, just don't expect a miracle." I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the latex stretching taut over my fingers. My portable forensic kit, a battered aluminum case that had seen more crime scenes than I cared to count, was already open on a nearby table. From it, I carefully extracted my magnifying loupe, a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, and a collection of sterile slides and tape lifts. I approached the gurney, taking a deep breath. The faint, sweet smell of embalming fluid was starting to permeate the air, a constant reminder of the finality of my work. With a gentle hand, I reached for the edge of the sheet and pulled it back, revealing the face of Maxwell Thorne. He was a man in his late 50s, his features now still and pale, a stark contrast to the dynamic image I'd seen in news reports. The single bullet wound was precisely centered, almost clinical. His hair, a distinguished silver, was neatly combed. His expensive suit, though rumpled, was clean. My eyes swept over him, not searching for the obvious, but for the infinitesimal. The things the human eye, even a trained one, usually dismissed. I moved slowly, methodically, starting from his head. I examined the hair follicles, the subtle lines around his eyes, the almost imperceptible dust that might have settled on his skin. I leaned closer, bringing the loupe to my eye, its magnification immediately plunging me into a microscopic world. His skin, indeed, was remarkably clean. No stray fibers, no dust motes that would normally cling to clothing or hair. The detective wasn't exaggerating. This was an unprecedented level of cleanliness for a murder victim. Most killers, no matter how meticulous, always left something. A single fiber, a speck of dirt, a smudge. I moved down to his suit jacket, then his shirt. I paid particular attention to the creases, the seams, the areas where particles might naturally collect. Nothing. My initial sweep yielded absolutely nothing. A familiar frustration began to prickle at the edges of my concentration. Was this truly the one where the killer had achieved perfection? I reached his hands, turning them over. His fingernails were clipped short, clean. No dirt, no skin, no foreign material. I pressed a clear adhesive tape lift against the skin of his palm, then another on the back of his hand, peeling them away carefully and placing them onto sterile slides. Standard procedure, but my gut told me they would be empty. Then, as I was about to move on, my gaze snagged on something almost invisible, clinging to the cuff of his expensive dress shirt just above the wrist. It was minuscule, no bigger than a pinprick, and nearly the same color as the fabric. My breath hitched. I brought the loop closer, my heart giving a small, hopeful thump. Under magnification, it resolved into a tiny, irregular shape, not a fiber, not a speck of dust. It had a crystalline structure, reflecting the light with a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, and it wasn't alone. Another, even smaller, was nestled within the fabric weave, just millimeters away. It was so small, so utterly insignificant, that anyone else would have missed it. The medical examiner, the first forensics team, even the detective. They were looking for the obvious, the things that screamed evidence. A very, very quiet whisper indeed. This wasn't a fiber or a hair. This was something else entirely, something unique. My mind immediately began to cycle through possibilities, drawing on years of obscure knowledge. Mineral dust, a specific type of pollen, perhaps. The killer hadn't been perfect. Not quite. I had found my impossible trace. From it, I carefully extracted my magnifying loupe, a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, and a collection of sterile evidence bags. The air in the hospital morgue intake area after midnight was a symphony of hushed hums and clicks. The ventilation system, the distant whir of machinery, the soft thud of a gurney wheel from down the hall. It was a sterile, cold environment, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and final, that no amount of cleaning could entirely erase. A medical examiner, a no-nonsense woman with tired eyes and hair pulled back in a tight bun, stood by the stainless steel examination table. The body of the tech CEO, draped partially by a sheet, lay before us. His face, even in death, held a hint of the sharp intelligence he was known for. He was dressed in what looked like expensive, tailored clothes, now rumpled and stained. "William," the medical examiner said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to absorb into the thick silence. "Glad you could make it so quickly. The detective is still at the scene, said it was clean as a whistle. No forced entry, no obvious weapon, just him strangled, looks like, no defensive wounds to speak of." "Clean as a whistle," I repeated, more to myself than to her. That phrase always made the hairs on my arms prickle. It usually meant the killer was either very good, very arrogant, or both. And it almost always meant they'd missed something only visible under a microscope. My kind of something. I approached the table, the rubber soles of my boots making no sound on the polished linoleum floor. The CEO's skin was pale, waxy under the harsh fluorescent lights. I could feel the weight of expectation on me, or perhaps the lack of it. They wanted confirmation, nothing here, just a perfectly executed crime. But my job was to challenge assumptions, to find the invisible threads that connected perpetrator to victim. I knew from experience that hair was a magnet for microscopic particles, a silent archive of recent environments. I lowered my loupe, adjusting the focus. The individual strands filled my vision, each one a miniature landscape of scales and oils. I moved slowly, meticulously, my breath held, searching for anything foreign, a fiber, a speck of dust, a telltale pollen grain. Nothing on the surface, just a few stray fibers from his own sweater. The killer had been thorough. I moved to his shoulders, then down his arms, paying close attention to the cuffs of his expensive shirt, the seams of his trousers. The medical examiner watched me, her expression unreadable. She'd seen me work before. She knew my process was slow, painstaking, and often yielded results others dismissed as impossible. The killer had likely assumed that by cleaning the scene, they had eradicated any chance of leaving a physical signature. They probably believed that any trace they might have inadvertently carried in or out would be indistinguishable from the general environmental background noise of a bustling city. That confidence, that perceived invisibility, was often their undoing. It led to tiny oversights. My eyes narrowed as I reached the victim's shoes. Not a scuff, not a speck of mud. Immaculately polished, as if he'd just stepped out of a high-end shoe store. But I wasn't looking for mud. I was looking for what might have clung to the very edges of the sole, the tiny crevices where the rubber met the leather, or the minuscule spaces between the stitching. I knelt, bringing the loop close to the heel of the left shoe. The leather was pristine, the rubber sole showing only the faintest signs of wear. But there, tucked deep into a minuscule seam where the heel met the upper, was a minuscule cluster of what looked like dust. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, certainly not something anyone cleaning a scene would notice or even consider significant. I held my breath, carefully positioning the fine-tipped tweezers. My hand was steady, a surgeon's precision honed by years of practice. I delicately scraped at the tiny accumulation, coaxing a few particles free. They were so small, barely visible even under the loop, like flecks of pale green dust. I gently transferred them to a sterile evidence bag, sealing it with a practiced snap. "Find something, William?" the medical examiner asked, his voice betraying a flicker of curiosity. "Maybe," I mumbled, already moving to the right shoe, repeating the process. More of the same pale green dust. This wasn't ordinary street grime. This had a uniform appearance, a distinct texture even at this microscopic level. My mind raced, sifting through the countless pollen and mineral samples I had catalogued over the years. This looked botanical. I stood up, holding the two tiny bags. This isn't typical urban dust, and it's certainly not something you'd pick up walking down a city street in the middle of the night. It's too uniform, too specific. I pulled out my portable microscope, a compact device I always carried for on-the-spot preliminary analysis. Carefully, I transferred a few grains from one of the bags onto a slide. I peered into the eyepiece, adjusting the focus. The image resolved, perfect spherical grains, each one adorned with intricate spiny projections. My breath hitched. I knew this pattern, it was unmistakable. Ambrosia artemisiafolia, common ragweed, but that wasn't right. Ragweed season was months away, and even then these grains were too large, too robust for typical ambrosia. I adjusted the light, rotating the slide. Then it hit me. The size, the morphology, the unique arrangement of the spines. This wasn't common ragweed. This was Ambrosia tenuifolia, a species of ragweed native to South America, often cultivated as an ornamental plant in specialized botanical gardens or high-end private conservatories. It was exceptionally rare to find it in North America, especially in this city, and certainly not outside a very controlled environment. The killer hadn't just cleaned the scene, they had meticulously scrubbed away every obvious trace. But they had missed the microscopic signature clinging to the victim's shoes, a signature left not by the victim, but by the killer themselves, or perhaps by something they had brushed against shortly before or after the act. It pointed not to the crime scene, but to an entirely different, very specific location. "This," I said, looking up at the medical examiner, a small, grim smile playing on my lips, "is not from around here, and it shouldn't be here at all." The clean scene suddenly looked a lot dirtier, and the killer, for all their meticulousness, had just left me a breadcrumb trail. A very rare, very specific breadcrumb trail. I peered into the eyepiece, adjusting the focus with a delicate turn of the knob. The image resolved, perfect spherical grains, each one adorned with intricate three-dimensional netting, like miniature, perfectly woven geodesic domes. My breath hitched, a small involuntary sound in the quiet of the makeshift lab. This wasn't just any pollen. This was Liriodendron chilipifera, commonly known as the tulip tree. My mind raced, already connecting the dots. Tulip trees were native to eastern North America, but they were also widely cultivated as ornamental trees in parks and large estates due to their distinctive, cup-shaped flowers and rapid growth. Finding Liriodendron pollen at a meticulously cleaned crime scene was unusual to say the least. It wasn't a common allergen, nor was it particularly ubiquitous in urban environments, not in the quantities I was seeing. The killer had been thorough, but they hadn't accounted for the almost invisible, the infinitesimally small. I pulled back from the microscope, my gaze fixed on the plastic bags containing the other samples. If the first bag yielded something so specific, what else lay hidden? I spent the next few hours lost in the rhythm of slide preparation and microscopic examination. The dust motes, the fabric fibers, the microscopic mineral fragments, each was a whispered clue, a fragment of a story waiting to be told. My fingers, usually so precise, moved with an almost frantic energy. The more I looked, the more a pattern began to emerge, not just from the pollen, but from the mineral dust. There were minute, almost translucent flakes of mica, and oddly, traces of a very fine, reddish-brown clay. It was late, bordering on early morning, when my phone buzzed, startling me from my intense focus. It was the detective, his voice raspy with fatigue. "William, you still at it? Any luck?" "More than luck, I think," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I need to see the victim again, and I have some preliminary findings that might explain a few things." He grunted. "Meet me at the hospital morgue intake area after midnight. They're keeping the body for us." The drive was a blur of streetlights and the low hum of my engine. My mind was still buzzing with the microscopic world I'd just left. The hospital morgue intake area after midnight was a desolate, sterile space, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something metallic. The fluorescent lights hummed with an oppressive, clinical whine, casting long, stark shadows. A single orderly, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually slumped posture, sat behind a scratched counter, filling out forms. Another uniformed officer stood a respectful distance away, observing us. "William," the detective acknowledged, pushing off the gurney. "What have you got? Don't tell me it's another dead end." "Quite the opposite," I said, pulling a small, sealed evidence bag from my kit. Inside were 2 meticulously prepared slides. I found significant traces of Liriodendron chilipifera pollen, tulip tree pollen, not just a few grains either. It was on the victim's clothing, in the dust collected from the floorboards, and even in the subtle residue on the base of the broken statue. The detective frowned, his brow furrowing. "Tulip tree, what's that tell us?" "It's not a common urban tree," I explained, choosing my words carefully. "And the quantity suggests prolonged exposure, or at least a very recent, close encounter. But that's not all. I also found traces of a very specific type of mineral dust, fine mica flakes, and a reddish-brown clay, almost ochre in color. It's distinct, and together they paint a picture." I paused, letting the information sink in. The detective's gaze sharpened, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. "Go on." "The tulip tree pollen, combined with this particular mineral composition, points to a very specific environment," I continued, my voice gaining a confident edge. "It suggests the killer, or at least the victim, spent time in an area with these elements, and from my initial analysis, it's not a city park or a typical suburban garden. The clay, in particular, is unique. It's often found in certain types of artisanal pottery studios or even specific geological formations, but the combination with the tulip tree, pointing to something more refined." I met the detective's gaze directly. "It's pointing to a botanical garden. Not just any garden, but one with a specific type of soil composition, likely curated for exotic plant displays, and with a significant collection of mature tulip trees. The reddish clay and mica are often used in specialized potting mixes, can be found in natural deposits within older, established garden grounds." The detective stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. "A botanical garden," he repeated, the words slow and disbelieving. "You're telling me our killer was at a botanical garden?" "Not necessarily the killer," I corrected, "but someone was, and they carried these traces out with them. The question is who and why and which one. This isn't just any garden. It's one with a specific horticultural profile, the kind that might have a dedicated conservatory or a very old, established section." My mind was already sifting through local botanical institutions, mentally cross-referencing their plant collections and soil types. This was no longer a blank slate. This was a compass needle, pointing with undeniable precision. The detective ran a hand over his face, a new kind of tension settling into his posture. "Okay, William, a botanical garden, that's specific. More specific than I thought we'd get from a clean scene. Do we have any of those around here that fit the bill?" "Several," I confirmed, a flicker of satisfaction momentarily cutting through my exhaustion, "but only 1 or 2 that are known for their extensive Liriodendron collections and unique soil profiles. I can narrow it down further with some more detailed geological maps and horticultural records." He nodded, a thoughtful, almost dangerous glint in his eyes. "All right, Get me that list. And any other details you can dig up on these specific places. We'll start there. He turned to the uniformed officer. Get a unit ready. We're going on a field trip. I felt a surge of adrenaline pushing back the weariness. This was it. The first tangible thread. The killer might have thought they'd erased their presence, but they hadn't accounted for the silent witnesses carried on the soles of their shoes, clinging to their clothes, inhaled with every breath. The chill in the hospital morgue intake area after midnight was a physical thing, seeping into my bones despite the thick sweater I'd pulled on. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the pervasive scent of antiseptic and something deeper, metallic and final, that always clung to these places. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, steady thrum, casting a harsh, unwavering glare on the stainless steel surfaces. Each clang of a distant gurney, each muffled cough from a corridor I couldn't see, amplified the solitude, making me feel like the last person awake in a sleeping city. A detective, a stoic woman with tired eyes and a perpetually creased trench coat, stood a respectful distance away, observing me with a quiet intensity. She hadn't spoken much since we'd arrived, just nodded when I'd explained my process, her presence a silent pressure. The victim, the tech CEO, lay on a gurney, shrouded in a white sheet, awaiting my scrutiny. My portable kit, a compact universe of brushes, slides, and collection vials, was already laid out on a nearby cart. "Ready, William?" the detective asked, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. I nodded, pulling on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. As I'll ever be. I approached the gurney, the sheet pulled back just enough to expose the victim's clothing. The clothes were dark, expensive, and like the apartment, meticulously clean. Too clean, perhaps. My eyes, however, weren't scanning for large stains or obvious tears. They were seeking the invisible, the microscopic narratives spun by dust, fibers, and pollen. I started with the shoulders, using a specialized vacuum attachment with a microfilter. The gentle whir was the only sound for several minutes as I systematically worked my way down the victim's jacket, then trousers. My mind was a catalog of possibilities, cross-referencing every trace against the known environment of the crime scene, the victim's profile, the time of year. I was looking for anything that contradicted the narrative of a pristine, undisturbed environment. Then I saw it, or rather, my equipment registered it. On a small patch of fabric near the victim's left cuff, the microfilter showed a denser collection than I expected. When I transferred the sample to a slide and placed it under my portable microscope, my breath hitched. Pollen, lots of it, and not just any pollen. The distinctive, almost spherical grains of Impatiens walleriana, commonly known as busy Lizzie, it was everywhere on this small patch, a vibrant, almost aggressive burst of yellow and orange under the lens. My first reaction was a jolt of triumph. This was it, the thread. Busy Lizzie was a common ornamental plant, often found in hanging baskets, window boxes, and garden beds. Its presence here, on the victim's clothing, could point to a specific location, a killer's garden, a path taken. The detective shifted, sensing my change in posture. "Find something?" she asked, stepping closer. I didn't answer immediately. My initial excitement was quickly giving way to a gnawing doubt. This wasn't just a few stray grains, it was a noticeable concentration, almost a dusting. And that was the problem. The crime scene had been stripped bare, wiped clean, every surface sanitized. A killer meticulous enough to erase every fingerprint, every blood spatter, every stray fiber, would surely not overlook such a prevalent botanical signature. It felt too easy, too obvious. I zoomed in on the pollen grains, examining their morphology, their state of preservation. They were fresh, intact, as if brushed against the plant only hours ago. But the victim had been found in a high-rise apartment, minimalist to a fault, no plants in sight. And the surrounding urban environment, while having some greenery, wasn't exactly overflowing with Impatiens in full bloom this time of year, certainly not in the quantities I was seeing. My mind raced, connecting disparate observations. The clean apartment, the lack of any other significant trace evidence, and now this perfectly placed, easily identifiable pollen. "It's pollen," I finally said, my voice low, a frown creasing my brow. "From a plant called Busy Lizzie. Impatiens walleriana." The detective peered over my shoulder at the microscope screen. "Is that good?" "It could be," I replied, pulling back from the eyepiece. "It's a common garden plant, but its presence here in this quantity on a victim found in a sterile environment, it feels off." I looked at her, then back at the microscope. Think about it. The killer went to extraordinary lengths to clean that apartment. They left almost nothing. So why would they leave behind such a clear, easily traceable botanical signature on the victim? The detective's brow furrowed, processing my words. I think it's a plant, she asked, the double meaning not lost on either of us. A deliberate misdirection, I confirmed, the words solidifying the suspicion in my mind. A red herring. The killer isn't just careful, they're trying to manipulate the investigation. This wasn't just a hunt for a perpetrator who made a mistake. This was a chess match. The killer wasn't just trying to hide their tracks, they were actively laying false ones. It meant I wasn't just looking for truth. I was looking for the lies hidden within the truth, and the truth hidden within the lies. The simple act of finding pollen had just complicated everything. This killer was playing a dangerous game, and I had just realized I was standing on their chessboard. The city was a hushed canvas of muted streetlights and silent buildings as I navigated the winding roads toward the hospital morgue intake area after midnight. A fine mist, clinging to the chilled air, blurred the edges of the world, mirroring the uncertainty that had begun to cloud my thoughts. That earlier surge of adrenaline had long since dissipated, replaced by a persistent, gnawing awareness of the killer's methodical precision. This wasn't just a hunt for a perpetrator who made a mistake. This was a chess match, and I had the distinct impression I was several moves behind. The sophistication of the deception, the layers of misdirection, it was all starting to feel less like a challenge and more like a taunt. A knot of apprehension tightened in my chest as I parked and stepped out. The air here carried that faint, metallic tang I'd come to associate with sterile despair. The morgue itself was a low, utilitarian building, stark against the city's skyline. Inside, the quiet hum of refrigeration units filled the narrow corridor, a constant, low thrum beneath the fluorescent lights. A night shift attendant, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually slumped posture, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle when I presented my credentials. "William, right? Here for the CEO," he murmured, his voice raspy, gesturing vaguely down a hallway without making eye contact. "Room 3, doors unlocked." I thanked him, the words feeling hollow in the echoing space, and proceeded alone. The door to room 3 hissed open, revealing a sterile environment of stainless steel and white tiles. Finality. On a gurney beneath a pristine white sheet lay the victim. The sheet was pulled back just enough to reveal the face, now a pale, placid mask. The CEO, once a titan of industry, now reduced to an object of forensic study. I retrieved my portable kit from its specialized case, the familiar weight of the tools a small comfort in the stark room. My objective was clear: find what the killer had missed, or more likely, what they hadn't even considered. The initial crime scene, or what we thought was the crime scene, had been a masterclass in erasure. Every surface scrubbed, every potential trace removed or replaced with a misleading counterpart. It made me wonder if the actual scene of the crime was somewhere else entirely, and the mansion merely a stage for a macabre play. My eyes scanned the CEO's body, starting with the outer clothing. The suit was expensive, tailored, and superficially clean. No obvious stains, no tears, no gross contamination. The killer had clearly taken great pains. I began my meticulous sweep, a handheld microscope pressed to my eye, moving slowly, inch by painstaking inch. Over the fabric, the suit lapels, the cuffs, the seams, the inside of the collar, every fold, every crease was a potential repository. I even checked the soles of his polished shoes, finding only the expected urban grit likely transferred during the body's transport. Nothing from the mansion, nothing from the false trail of pollen, nothing from anywhere specific, really, just generic city dust. Frustration began to prickle at the edges of my focus. Had they been that thorough? Had I been so completely outmaneuvered? The CEO's hands, I noted, were clean, manicured, but the fingernails, though short, still offered a microscopic landscape. I took samples, scraping gently, but again, the initial scan revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just epithelial cells and a few stray textile fibers from his own clothing. I sighed, a quiet puff of vapor in the cold air, and adjusted the angle of the main overhead lamp. Then, I turned my attention to the less obvious parts of the suit, not the outer surfaces, but the deep, protected folds. I moved to the inner lining of the jacket, carefully peeling back a small section near the armpit seam, where fabric met fabric in a tight, rarely disturbed space. This was the kind of place where a truly persistent trace might hide, shielded from even the most aggressive cleaning. Under the microscope, for a long moment, there was nothing but the tightly woven synthetic fibers of the suit lining. Then, as I adjusted the focus, a distinct, almost iridescent sheen of microscopic particles caught my eye. They were tiny, barely visible even at high magnification, glittering faintly like scattered dust motes, but with an unnatural regularity. My breath hitched. These weren't urban particulates, they were crystalline structures, sharp-edged, with a faint, unusual luminescence under the focused beam. They were embedded, almost fused, into the fabric, suggesting a significant, sustained contact. My heart began to pick up pace, a steady drum against my ribs. This was it. This was something the killer hadn't anticipated or couldn't possibly have cleaned away without destroying the garment. I carefully collected a sample, transferring the minute particles to a specialized slide for immediate analysis with my portable Raman spectrometer. The device whirred softly, a soft green light illuminating the sample. The results flashed on the small screen, a complex spectral graph that I instantly recognized. It wasn't pollen. It wasn't typical soil. It was a specific silicate mineral, one that forms under intense geothermal pressure, typically found in very particular geological veins, often associated with mining operations or deep excavation sites, far, far from any urban dwelling, let alone a polished tech CEO's mansion. The CEO hadn't been killed at his pristine home. He hadn't even been in a typical urban environment shortly before his death. He had been somewhere remote, somewhere industrial, somewhere hidden beneath the earth. This wasn't just a misdirection, this was a complete redirection. The killer wasn't just meticulous. They had completely orchestrated the narrative of the crime, moving the body, cleaning it, and placing it in a false setting. This mineral dust, clinging stubbornly to the inner lining of his suit, told a story of a place utterly alien to the life of a tech CEO. It meant the killer wasn't necessarily someone from his lavish world, but someone with access to, or a connection with, a very specific, very non-glamorous subterranean environment. And now, by finding this trace, I had just stepped out of the elegant, deceptive world of the CEO's mansion and directly into the killer's true, dangerous domain. The air was cold, crisp, and carried a faint, clinical scent that did little to mask the underlying odor of finality. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unwavering intensity, casting a harsh, shadowless glare on everything. This was the hospital morgue intake area after midnight, a place where the living rarely lingered, and the dead were stripped of their secrets. I stepped inside, the sound of my shoes squeaking on the polished floor echoing unnaturally loud. A single examination table dominated the center of the room, stark and metallic. On it, beneath a pristine white sheet, lay the prominent tech CEO. The sheet was pulled up to the chin, leaving only a glimpse of a pale, still face. My stomach tightened, a familiar knot of professional detachment warring with a natural human unease. This wasn't about the person, I reminded myself, it was about the particles. "Good evening, William," a voice greeted, startling me. I hadn't noticed the morgue attendant, a lean individual in scrubs, standing by a stainless steel counter laden with instruments. "Everything's ready for you. The police pathologist finished her preliminary exam an hour ago. No obvious external injuries beyond the cause of death, as you know. Clean as a whistle," she said. I nodded, appreciating the understatement. "Thank you." I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material stretching taut over my fingers. From my kit, I extracted a set of fine-tipped tweezers, specialized adhesive lifts, and a portable microspectrometer. My eyes scanned the room, noting the air filtration system whirring softly in the corner, designed to prevent any cross-contamination. Every precaution had been taken, but no system was foolproof against what I sought. Approaching the table, I paused, taking a slow, deep breath. The faint, metallic tang in the air seemed to sharpen, hinting at the sterile chemicals used in preservation. I carefully pulled back the sheet, revealing the victim's body. The CEO was dressed in what appeared to be expensive, albeit slightly rumpled, business attire. My gaze immediately went to the edges, the seams, the places where trace evidence loved to hide. I started with the victim's hair, using a sterile comb to collect any loose strands onto an adhesive lift. Then, the collar of the shirt, the cuffs, the lapels. I worked slowly, meticulously, a small handheld microscope pressed against my eye, illuminating the intricate weave of the fabric. Most of what I found was predictable: common textile fibers, a few stray human hairs, dust motes that could have originated from anywhere. Nothing jumped out, nothing screamed clue. The pathologist's assessment of clean as a whistle seemed depressingly accurate. Frustration began to prick at me. This killer was good, almost unnervingly so. They hadn't just cleaned the crime scene, they'd seemingly ensured the victim carried no telltale signs either. But I knew better. There was always something. My gaze drifted to the victim's hands, resting stiffly on his chest. The nails were trimmed, clean, too clean, perhaps. I leaned in closer, bringing the microscope's lens right to the tips of the fingers. Under the harsh light, the skin looked almost translucent. I began to gently probe beneath the nails with a minute, sterile brush, then used a specialized vacuum sampling tool designed to collect even submicron particles. The first few samples yielded nothing but epidermal cells and a few inert environmental particulates. My brow furrowed. This was proving harder than I anticipated. Then, a flicker. Deep within the matrix of the fingernail on the victim's right index finger, almost invisibly small, I saw it. A cluster of minute, crystalline particles glinting faintly. They weren't typical dust, nor were they organic. They possessed an unusual angularity, a strange, almost metallic luster. My heart gave a quiet thrum. This was it. I carefully collected the minuscule fragments using an ultrafine pipette, transferring them to a microscopic slide. The portable spectrometer hummed to life as I positioned the slide beneath its sensor. The display flickered, then stabilized, revealing a complex chemical signature. My eyes widened as I processed the data. High concentrations of a specific, rare silicate mineral, not entirely unheard of, but certainly not common. What truly caught my attention, however, was its combination with a particular metallic oxide and traces of an unusual, heavy rare earth element. This wasn't naturally occurring mineral dust. This was a byproduct. My mind raced, sifting through years of accumulated knowledge, databases of industrial pollutants, specialized materials, geological anomalies. Where had I seen this signature before? The combination of these specific elements felt familiar, yet elusive. I scrolled through my personal research archives on my tablet, cross-referencing the spectral data. Then, the match. The screen illuminated with a technical report from a few years prior, a niche publication on advanced materials engineering. The spectral signature was almost identical to the dust produced during the experimental smelting and refining of a proprietary, high-strength, lightweight alloy. An alloy that had been developed for a specialized, experimental aerospace project, a next-generation drone prototype that had ultimately failed to secure funding and was shelved. The project had been spearheaded by a small, highly secretive research firm, a direct competitor to the victim's own company in certain cutting-edge technology sectors. The reveal hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just dust. It was a fingerprint of industrial espionage, a ghost of a failed ambition. The alloy had been notorious for its manufacturing challenges, including the release of these very specific, highly abrasive dust particles during its production. The victim had these particles embedded under his fingernail, suggesting a struggle, a direct physical confrontation, or at the very least, close contact with someone who had recently handled this material. The crime scene had been meticulously cleaned, yes, the body transported, but the killer hadn't accounted for the almost invisible particles that clung to the victim, remnants of a violent encounter that had transpired elsewhere. This wasn't a random act. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. This pointed to a deeply rooted rivalry, a desperate act stemming from a fierce competition for technological supremacy. My gaze returned to the CEO's still face. He hadn't just been murdered. He had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone suspected. The killer hadn't left no trace. They'd left a microscopic, industrial secret, a breadcrumb leading directly to a specific, highly specialized manufacturing process, and by extension to the people behind it. The game had just gotten infinitely more complicated and infinitely more perilous. I had the where, the what, and a strong hint of the why. Now I needed the who. The attendant gave a slight bow and retreated, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving me in the stark silence. From my kit, I extracted a set of fine-tipped tweezers, specialized adhesive lifts, and a portable microscope, my arsenal against the invisible. The hospital morgue intake area after midnight was a study in clinical desolation. Fluorescent lights hummed with a low, persistent thrum, casting a sterile glow on stainless steel tables and a lone gurney. The air, conditioned to a precise chill, carried the faint, metallic scent of disinfectant and something else, something deeper, that always lingered in places where life had ceased. I moved to the gurney, where the victim's clothing lay meticulously bagged and tagged, awaiting further processing. The lead detective had given me carte blanche, a testament to his growing trust in my unconventional methods. My focus narrowed. The previous examinations had been thorough, but I wasn't looking for obvious fibers or fluids. I was hunting ghosts, the almost nothing that spoke volumes. I started with the victim's suit jacket, paying particular attention to the collar and cuffs, areas often overlooked in a cursory cleanup but prone to micro-transfers during a struggle. The portable microscope, a marvel of miniaturization and optical clarity, hummed as I powered it on. Its screen, a small, bright window, became my portal into another dimension. I slowly dragged an adhesive lift across a lapel, then pressed it to a slide. Under the lens, the world exploded into a chaotic tapestry of textile fibers, skin cells, and generic dust motes. My eyes scanned, trained to filter the mundane from the significant, a silent, relentless search. Minutes stretched into an hour. My back ached, my eyes burned, but I kept going, driven by a stubborn certainty that something had to be there. The killer had been too confident, too thorough. Perfection was a myth, especially when panic was involved. Then, a cluster of shapes resolved themselves on the screen, unlike anything else. Not a common environmental pollen, not a typical indoor contaminant. These were distinct, almost alien in their symmetry, elongated, with a finely textured surface and a singular pore. My breath hitched. I cross-referenced the image with my internal database, a mental library built over decades. Dracæna draco, dragon tree, an ornamental plant, often found in high-end indoor landscaping. Not native to this region, it was a rare find, but not impossible. The significance, however, lay in its presence here, on a victim found in an otherwise sterile environment. This wasn't incidental. This was a direct transfer. My heart began a slow, insistent thrum against my ribs. I pressed on, my movements now imbued with a renewed sense of purpose. I moved to the victim's trousers, specifically the hem, where microscopic particles often settled or were scuffed onto fabric during movement or a fall. Again, the methodical sweep, the intense scrutiny, and there it was. Not organic this time. Irregular, crystalline fragments shimmering faintly even on the monochrome screen. My mind raced, cross-referencing again. Volcanic aggregate. Not just any volcanic aggregate, but a specific type used in luxury landscaping, known for its unique aesthetic and drainage properties. It was a signature material, imported, expensive, and distinctly recognizable. The Dracæna draco pollen and the volcanic aggregate dust. Together, they painted a picture, a clear, damning portrait of a specific environment. My mind immediately flashed to the news reports, the glossy architectural magazine features on the opulent new residence of the victim's business partner, a sprawling atrium featuring mature Dracæna draco specimens, and external landscaping boasting bespoke volcanic aggregate pathways. The killer had carried these traces, unwitting souvenirs of their own home, onto the victim. They'd scrubbed the crime scene clean, but they hadn't scrubbed themselves thoroughly enough. I straightened up, pulling off my gloves. My fingers fumbled slightly as I retrieved my phone, my usual steady hands betraying a tremor of adrenaline. I dialed the lead detective's number. It was well past 2 in the morning, but I knew he'd be awake. "Detective," I answered, my voice steadier than I expected. "I have it, the killer and the evidence. Get the business partner here now and bring a warrant for his shoes and clothing, especially his shoes." An hour later, the detective stood beside me, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the small screen of my microscope. Across the table, the business partner sat, flanked by 2 officers, his initial air of bewildered indignation slowly eroding. He was a man accustomed to control, to projecting an image of unassailable success. And these, I switched slides, are microscopic fragments of a specific volcanic aggregate, both found in minute quantities on the victim's clothing, consistent with direct transfer during a struggle. The business partner's eyes, which had been darting between me and the detective, finally settled on the screen. Muscle twitched in his jaw. "These are unique markers, sir," I continued, my voice measured, "not common to the victim's residence or the general environment of the city, but they are, according to public records and recent architectural profiles, abundant in your own home. The atrium with the dragon trees, the bespoke pathways, you see." I pointed to a particularly distinctive fragment of volcanic glass. "This isn't a coincidence. This isn't contamination. This is you, leaving a piece of your world, an irrefutable signature on the victim." The business partner scoffed, a forced, brittle sound. "This is absurd. Microscopic dust. You're building a fantasy on dust." "A fantasy," I countered, meeting his gaze, "that places you at the scene in direct contact with the victim, despite your carefully constructed alibi and the meticulously cleaned crime scene. You wore these traces, sir. You carried them from your home, and in the violence of the moment, you transferred them to the victim. You tried to erase your presence, but you couldn't erase these." The mask began to crack. His eyes, once defiant, now held a flicker of something raw and desperate. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The business partner slumped, his bravado utterly gone, leaving behind only the shell of a man caught in his own web of deceit. The click of handcuffs echoed in the cold, sterile air, a sharp, final sound. I watched as he was led away. The silence in the hospital morgue intake area after midnight returning, but now it felt different. My shoulders sagged. The tension, a tight knot that had lived in my stomach for days, slowly began to unravel, leaving a strange ache in its wake. It wasn't relief, not exactly. More like the exhaustion after a long, silent scream. The detective, a man whose face was usually a mask of weary resolve, actually offered a small, almost imperceptible nod in my direction. I really did it. I found myself looking down at my shoes, a sudden familiar wave of discomfort washing over me. Praise always felt like a foreign language, something I struggled to translate. My work was about observation, about meticulous detail, not about accolades. I just followed the evidence, I mumbled, gesturing vaguely towards the empty gurney where the victim's body still lay, covered by a pristine white sheet. The shape beneath it was a stark reminder of the human cost of my triumph. The detective chuckled, a dry, tired sound. "Followed the evidence? William, I found the evidence where no one else even thought to look. Those pollen grains, the mineral dust. It was genius. Without I would have walked. Probably would have gotten away with it for years." He paused, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "We're going to make sure my contribution is properly recognized in the report. This isn't just a win for the department. It's a testament to what real forensic science can achieve." The idea of recognition made my skin prickle. My mind was already replaying the minute details, the specific striations on the quartz, the unique morphology of the Phacelia californica pollen that had clung to the victim's shoe, connecting him to the killer's secluded workshop. It was the thrill of the chase, the intellectual puzzle, that drove me, not the spotlight. I preferred the quiet hum of the lab, the magnified world under my microscope, where truth was revealed in specks invisible to the naked eye. "Just glad we got him," I managed, my gaze drifting back to the sheeted form. The air conditioning hummed, a low, continuous drone that did little to warm the room. The scent of disinfectant was strong, a futile attempt to erase the undeniable presence of mortality. The detective clapped me lightly on the shoulder, a rare gesture from him. "Go home, William, get some rest, I've earned it." He turned to speak with a junior officer, already discussing the next steps, the paperwork, the long road to trial. I stood there for a moment longer, my eyes fixed on the gurney. The case was closed, the killer identified, the motive clear. And yet something nagged at me, a faint tremor of unease, like a single off-key note in an otherwise perfect symphony. I walked slowly towards the gurney, a strange compulsion pulling me forward. The assistant medical examiner had already left, the preliminary work done, the body awaiting final release. I knew I should leave, but my feet wouldn't obey. I reached the gurney, my fingers hovering over the crisp white sheet. The detective was still talking quietly by the door, his back to me. No one was paying attention. With a deep breath, I gently lifted the edge of the sheet, just enough to expose the victim's right hand, which lay still and pale on the gurney. My eyes, trained to find the unseen, immediately focused. There, nestled between the thumb and forefinger, almost invisible against the pallor of the skin, was a microscopic cluster of fibers. They weren't from the struggle, those had been catalogued, identified as belonging to the killer's jacket. These were different, finer, so delicate they looked like spun moonlight. I leaned closer, my breath held. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital morgue intake area after midnight, I could just make out their unique structure. They were a specific type of silk, dyed a soft, almost iridescent lavender. Not the rough, industrial silk often used in clothing, but the exceptionally fine, rare kind sometimes found in luxurious, handcrafted textiles. And clinging to these fibers, almost imperceptible, was a scattering of pollen grains. Not the phacelia that had cracked the case, but something else entirely. Something from an ornamental orchid, a specific hybrid, its delicate grains unmistakable. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The victim had been alone, preparing for the evening. He wouldn't have been wearing such a delicate fabric, certainly not holding an orchid during a business meeting. This wasn't evidence of the struggle. This was something personal, a last private moment, perhaps a cherished gift, a small, beautiful object, a final comfort held close before the violence erupted. The silk, the orchid pollen, it painted a silent, tragic picture of a man caught unaware, holding something precious, something beautiful in his last moments of peace. The killer had meticulously cleaned the scene, but he hadn't accounted for the intimacy of a final, tender gesture. This wasn't evidence that would change the verdict. It wouldn't bring the victim back. It was a secret, a final, poignant detail that only I had seen. And as I carefully, gently lowered the sheet back into place, a new heavy kind of tension settled in my chest. The case was closed, yes. But the stories, the quiet, hidden truths, they were never truly finished. The hum of the refrigeration units was the only constant sound in the hospital morgue intake area after midnight, a low, mechanical thrum that vibrated through the worn linoleum floor and up into the soles of my shoes. It was a sterile, unforgiving place, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and cold that clung to the air like a shroud. I stood by a stainless steel gurney, my hands clasped behind my back, the silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of my own pulse. The detective, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, leaned against a wall, his gaze fixed on the double doors at the far end of the corridor. We'd been waiting for what felt like an eternity, though the wall clock insisted only 20 minutes had passed since his call. My mind, however, wasn't idle. It was a whirlwind of microscopic images, a rapid-fire slideshow of the evidence that had brought us here. The Phacelia californica pollen, with its distinctive spiky exine, clinging to the victim's shoe, a silent botanical witness. The quartz dust, its striations unique, almost a fingerprint of the specific grinding wheel used in the killer's secluded workshop. Every detail, every minute trace, converged into an undeniable narrative. The idea of recognition from earlier, that profound sense of understanding, had solidified into an irrefutable truth. I had seen the world through the killer's unwitting eyes, piecing together their movements, their tools, their environment, all from what they thought was nothing. A sharp click echoed down the hallway, followed by the muffled thud of footsteps. The double doors swung inward, revealing two uniformed officers escorting a figure between them. The killer. My breath caught, not in fear, but in a peculiar mix of anticipation and finality. They were brought to a halt just a few feet from me, the detective pushing off the wall to stand beside me. "William, tell them," the detective said, his voice low but firm. I took a deep breath, the sterile air doing little to calm the tremor in my chest. This wasn't a lab presentation, nor a quiet conversation with a colleague. This was the moment of reckoning, the culmination of days spent poring over particles invisible to the naked eye. The victim, I began, my voice steadying with each word, was moved post-mortem. The soil on his shoes, specifically the Phacelia californica pollen grains, indicated a very specific microclimate, a shaded coastal scrub environment. An environment, as it happens, identical to the one surrounding my workshop. I pointed to the killer, whose composure was starting to fray, a muscle twitching in their jaw. "And then there's the quartz," I continued, stepping closer to a tray I'd prepared, displaying magnified images on a small tablet. Microscopic fragments embedded in the victim's clothing and hair. These aren't just any quartz. These fragments bear specific striations, a pattern consistent with a diamond-tipped grinding wheel, one used to shape raw quartz crystals, a tool I believe that I use regularly in my craft. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, watching the killer's eyes widen imperceptibly. We found residual quartz dust in my workshop, matching the unique mineral composition and the grinding patterns. It was the same dust, transferred from my clothes, my hands, my tools, onto the victim as I moved him. The killer's carefully constructed mask crumbled. Their eyes, previously defiant, now darted between my tablet and the detective's stern face. A low, guttural sound escaped their throat, a mixture of disbelief and sudden horror. They had been so meticulous, so confident in their invisible crime, and yet the earth itself had betrayed them. The detective stepped forward, placing a hand on the killer's shoulder. That workshop, the one I thought was so secluded, so private, it was my undoing. The plants, the dust, they speak volumes, don't they? The killer slumped, their shoulders caving in, the fight draining from them like air from a punctured tire. The uniformed officers tightened their grip, leading the now subdued killer away, the double doors swinging shut with a soft click that echoed the finality of the moment. "Well done, William," the detective said, a rare smile gracing his lips. He clapped me on the back, a gesture that, from him, felt like a medal. I've seen a lot of cases, but never one cracked by a handful of dirt and some flour dust. I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet satisfaction that resonated deep within. It wasn't the thrill of the chase or the drama of a courtroom, but the profound, quiet joy of understanding, of seeing the hidden truths. This case, with its intricate web of deception, had pushed me beyond the comfortable confines of my lab. I had spoken to colleagues, collaborated with investigators, and in a way, confronted the very human ugliness that my science sought to expose. My initial reservation, my tendency to retreat into the world of the microscopic, had been challenged. I hadn't just found a killer, I had found a new dimension to my own abilities. My mind was already drifting, not to rest, but to the possibilities. The world was a vast, complex tapestry, woven with countless threads of evidence, visible and invisible. And I, William, the forensic botanist, felt a quiet certainty that I was uniquely positioned to unravel some of its most stubbornly knotted secrets.